The evening is slowly falling. You may already be lying in bed or sitting in a comfortable chair, wrapped in a blanket. The air around you is calm. The light is soft. There is no urgency here. Nothing that requires your attention except the slow unfolding of words. We will not rush. The world can wait while we slowly wander into another time, another life, another way of being. Before we begin, I would like to ask you for a small gesture of goodwill and subscribe. It would make us happy, and we would understand that we are trying for you, dear friends, for a reason. You can also leave a comment. Thank you. So today's story will take us back to the Middle Ages, to the distant lands and quiet chambers of Queen Isabella of Castile, a woman of noble birth who is remembered not for her military campaigns or grand political speeches, but for something far more mundane and yet strangely revealing. In her entire life, Isabella is said to have bathed only twice. Once at birth, when midwives washed the newborn baby, swaddled it, and whispered prayers over its tiny face, and again, many years later, on the eve of her wedding. This detail may surprise us now. In today's world, where hot water flows from the tap and soap waits patiently in a bowl, the thought of bathing only twice in a lifetime seems almost unimaginable. But in Isabella's time, customs, beliefs, and even the very air around people's lives were different. Hygiene was understood differently. Comfort was measured in different terms. And water, far from being a neutral substance, was sometimes considered hazardous to health. But let us not rush. Before we meet Isabella, before we imagine her at birth, before we stand in the candlelit rooms of her bridal chamber, we must first slow our thoughts to the pace of her world. The Middle Ages were not in a hurry. Life was shaped by the changing seasons, the slow ripening of crops, the rhythm of bells in monasteries and trading towns. We too can tune into that rhythm, leaving behind the hurried pulse of the present. Imagine, if you will, the lands of Castile in the late 14th century. They are not often mentioned in history textbooks. A small principality, quiet compared to the great kingdoms of France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire. The capital is a modest fortress city, with narrow streets winding between half-timbered houses. The castle stands on a low hill, its stone walls worn by wind and rain. In its keep, fires burn in large hearths, not only for warmth, but also to drive away the moisture that seeps into the stones. It is winter when we arrive. In the countryside, snow has fallen, smoothing the lines of the fields, hiding the furrows left by the plow. In the city, tracks in the frost mark the paths between the bakery, the market square, and the chapel. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, mixed with something more pungent, the scent of tallow candles, a hint of dried herbs hung in doorways to ward off disease. People move slowly, their cloaks pulled tight against the cold, their breath forming little clouds that disappear into the still air. We might be tempted to imagine a medieval city bustling at any hour. But in fact, most of the day was quiet, especially in the cold months. The first sounds of the morning were often the ringing of church bells, steep, slow tones that rolled over the rooftops and echoed off the castle walls. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster might crow. A dog might bark briefly, then fall silent again. The streets did not fill with activity until the sun rose high enough to soften the frost and illuminate the narrow alleys. Somewhere in the castle, in a room warmed by an oak log fire, Queen Isabella was born. Her birth would have been marked by quiet activity, not by noisy celebration. In noble homes, Only women attended the birth. Midwives, nurses, perhaps her mother's closest maids of honor. The room would be dimly lit by candles or the glow of a fire. The air might be heavy with the scent of rosemary or juniper, which were burned to purify the space. Outside, the world would go on with its slow rhythms. Kitchen servants kneading bread, grooms carrying hay, guards patrolling the walls. After the baby was born, the midwives would bathe her, a small, meticulous ritual. Warm water from a copper basin, linen cloths to wipe the skin, no scented soap, no foaming bubbles, just water and cloth, perhaps with a drop of wine or vinegar mixed in to cleanse and strengthen the body. Thus Isabella received her first bath, a simple act at the very beginning of her life. She was then wrapped tightly in soft, swaddling clothes, keeping her limbs straight and her body warm. She had not touched water like this for many years. Why so seldom? The answer is not that medieval people did not care for cleanliness. Rather, their understanding of cleanliness was shaped by different ideas, many of which came from ancient medical theories. Physicians of the time believed that the body's health depended on a balance of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that too much exposure to water could disturb this balance. Warm baths, in particular, were thought to open the pores of the skin, allowing illness to enter. In an age when fevers, plagues, and strange ailments could strike without warning, people took such advice seriously. Instead of bathing, cleanliness was often maintained by changing linen underclothes, which could be laundered more easily than an entire body could be bathed. White linen was valued not only for its softness, but for its ability to absorb sweat and oil from the skin. Regular combing of the hair, wiping of the hands and face with a damp cloth, and the use of scented herbs all played a role in personal hygiene. Baths did happen, especially in bathhouses or on special occasions, but for the nobility, they were rare events, carried out with caution. And so, as we walk slowly into Isabella's story, we must picture a life where water is precious, fire is essential, and the act of bathing is not a daily routine, but a marked event, remembered and remarked upon. A life where scents of lavender or sage might cling to clothing far more often than the scent of soap. Where the warmth of a fur-lined robe on a winter morning was more valued than the freshness of recently washed skin. Isabella's childhood would pass within the quiet halls of the castle, with lessons in embroidery, music, and courtly manners. She would walk through the great hall where banners hung heavy with dust, eat from pewter dishes beside her parents, and kneel in the chapel where the light filtered through colored glass onto the stone floor. She would play in the castle gardens when the weather allowed, stepping carefully between the herbs and flowers planted there for both beauty and medicine. But through all these years, the idea of bathing, the kind that involved a tub of water, a heated room, and a deliberate washing of the body, would be absent from her daily life. It would be something almost ceremonial, reserved for a time when life was about to change. We will speak of that second bath later. For now, in this opening hour, we will linger in the slow unfolding of the 14th century world, in the stillness of the castle halls, in the quiet habits of a time when life moved to the rhythm of bells, seasons, and candlelight. And so our journey begins. In the long, quiet corridors of the Kostilska castle, the sound of footsteps on stone carried softly and rarely in haste. For Isabella, growing from infant to young girl, the day began not with a splash of water, but with a gentle rustle of linen. Her nursemaid, a woman named Marina, broad-shouldered and slow of step, would draw back the bed curtains in the early morning. The light filtering into the chamber was pale, softened by the frost clinging to the window's leaded panes. It was not the sharp, brilliant light of summer, but a muted silver, a color that seemed to belong only to winter mornings in these northern lands. Marina's voice would be quiet, almost like a hum. She would greet the child, not with hurried words, but with the same phrases she had used every morning since Isabella could remember. The familiarity of this routine was part of its comfort. The castle was not a place of surprises in the life of a young noble. Each day unfolded with the predictability of a well-tended clock. Though there were no clocks in Isabella's chambers, only the ringing of bells from the chapel tower. Before any other task, Isabella's linen shift was changed. This was the true heart of daily hygiene in her time, the replacement of the garment worn closest to the skin. Linen, woven from the flax plant, was smooth and cool to the touch, and far gentler on the skin than wool. It absorbed the body's natural oils and sweat, and by changing it often, one could remain clean without frequent bathing. The night's garment would be taken away to be washed, boiled in large kettles with lye soap or sometimes just with water and ash, then laid out to dry in the castle's laundry rooms. The smell of freshly laundered linen was not the crisp floral scent we know today from soap powders, but something earthier, mixed with the faint aroma of the wood smoke from the drying racks. Once the clean shift was slipped over her head, Isabella would feel a familiar freshness against her skin. It was this sensation, not the dampness of water, that she associated with the idea of being clean. Hair, too, was tended each morning, and this could take some time. Isabella's hair was long, pale brown, and easily tangled in the night. Marina would seat her on a low stool near the window, where the light was best, and take up a comb carved from horn. The teeth were smooth but firm, and each stroke would be slow, from the crown to the tips, untangling and smoothing without haste. The combing served more than one purpose. It was not only for appearance, but also for health. Regular combing helped remove dust, tiny insects, and stray bits of dried skin from the scalp. In a world without shampoos, this was a necessary form of cleansing. Occasionally, a scented powder might be sprinkled lightly onto the hair, made from ground herbs such as rosemary or lavender, lending a faint, pleasant aroma that lingered through the day. This daily ritual of combing was almost meditative. The sound of the comb through hair was soft and repetitive, the kind of sound that could make a child drowsy again if she was not already fully awake. Outside, crows might call from the trees in the castle yard, their voices sharp in the cold air. Somewhere far off, the rhythmic thump of a pestle in a mortar might carry from the kitchen, where herbs were being ground for the day's cooking. After hair came the wiping of the face and hands. For this, Marina would pour a little water into a small copper basin. The water was not warm unless the day was especially cold or the child was unwell. A folded piece of linen would be dipped in and wrung out until it was only damp, then used to gently wipe the face, the corners of the eyes, and the small hands that would soon be holding a wooden spoon at breakfast. This water wiping was a substitute for what we would think of as washing. The amount of water used was minimal, enough to refresh, not enough to soak. In fact, the idea of immersing one's body in large amounts of water each morning would have seemed excessive, even strange, to most people of Isabella's time. Clothing, too, was part of hygiene. Over her shift, Isabella would be dressed in woolen layers, an undergown, and on colder days, a lined overdress. Wool, though coarser than linen, was warm and durable. The garments might be brushed with a stiff cloth to remove dust or crumbs from the previous day, but they were not washed often. The underlinen absorbed most of the body's oils, keeping the outer garments clean by the standards of the day. In her early years, these garments were simple, designed for comfort and ease of movement. As she grew, the cut and decoration would become more elaborate, reflecting her status and the expectations of a noblewoman. But even as embroidery grew finer and fabrics richer, the underlying rhythm of dressing remained the same. Fresh linen against the skin, wool above, layers arranged carefully for both warmth and propriety. Meals, lessons, and play followed, each with their own quiet customs that also touched on hygiene. Hands were wiped before eating, not with soap and water, but with a dampened cloth or with small pieces of bread used almost like a towel, absorbing oils or dirt before being discarded. At table, one's hands were kept clean by eating with only the tips of the fingers or with a knife. Forks were rare and, in some circles, still seen as an unnecessary luxury. The air in the castle was rarely still. There was always the faint drift of smoke from the hearths, the scent of rushes strewn on the floor, sometimes sprinkled with herbs to mask less pleasant smells. Even in the cleanest noble households, the mingling scents of food, people, animals, and wood smoke created an atmosphere unlike anything in the modern world. And so the idea of freshness was relative, not the scent of sea air or a spring meadow, but the comfort of familiar household smells, unchanged day to day. For a child like Isabella, this way of living was not something to question. It was simply the way the world worked. The absence of daily bathing was no more remarkable than the absence of glass windows in every room or the absence of mechanical clocks on the walls. It was not a lack. It was the norm. We might imagine her looking out over the snowy courtyard from her chamber window, holding a small piece of embroidery she had been learning to stitch, her hair smooth from morning combing, her shift clean and fresh beneath her wool dress. She was, by the measures of her time, perfectly presentable, perfectly cared for. And all of it had been done without a single drop of water touching more than her face and hands. In the next part of her story, we will follow her as she grows, not in sudden leaps, but in the slow, seasonal cycles that marked a medieval childhood, and see how these small acts of cleanliness fit into the larger patterns of her life in the castle. By the time Isabella was 12, the castle and its rhythms had become so deeply ingrained in her heart that she could tell the seasons without even looking out the window. The air had its own characteristics. In winter, the rooms smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and the faint scent of damp wool. In spring, through the open shutters, the smell of thawed earth, sharp and fresh. Summer brought a warm, almost sweet heaviness to the air, and the occasional smell of rain on hot stone. Autumn was cool and slightly dusty, with the aroma of harvested grain and apples stored in the cellars. For Isabella, the seasons were not just a change of weather. They brought a slow change of clothing, food, responsibilities, and personal hygiene. Hygiene, in the medieval sense, was not a fixed routine, but something that changed smoothly with the months, as naturally as the castle's fires flared up and faded in their hearths. Winter, layers and enclosed spaces. In the cold months, when the world outside the castle was still and the snow pressed down on the lower walls, Isabella would dress in her heaviest dresses. Underneath them, Her linens were changed as often as the washerwomen could manage. No easy task in winter. When drying clothes could take days, she rarely touched cold water during these months. To wash her face and hands, warm water was brought from the kitchen in a covered jug, its warmth preserved by thick cloths wrapped around it. Marina would place the basin close to the fire before dipping it in the cloth, and the steam would rise faintly into the air, carrying a faint metallic smell. The winter air in the castle was stifling and still. Fires burned in the great hall, in the private chambers, and even in the smaller service rooms. But they left a haze behind that settled on the tapestries and curtains. This was not considered unpleasant. The smell of smoke was the smell of warmth, of safety. If the air was ever refreshed, it was by handfuls of dried herbs scattered among the reeds on the floor. Sweet aspen, lavender, and thyme were favorites, their scent released when stepped on. Spring, opening the shutters. When the first signs of thaw appeared, the drops of water dripping from icicles, the sound of snow softening underfoot. The castle itself seemed to breathe again. The shutters were opened to let in the cool air. The reeds on the floor were swept and replaced, a slow process that filled the corridors with the scent of new hay mixed with mint and marjoram. Isabella's clothes became lighter. Her shirts dried more quickly after washing so they could be changed more often. Combing her hair became a longer and more painstaking task, as this was the season when head lice were most common. Marina would part Isabella's hair into small sections, carefully inspecting each one, and if she found any, apply a mixture of vinegar and herbs. The air itself felt cleaner, and in the spring more water was used to wipe her face, hands, and neck daily. It was still far from a full bath, but it was more generous than in the colder months. Summer, heat and dust. Summer in the lands of the Kosselvan lands was warm, but not often stifling. However, the air in the castle could become heavy during long periods without rain. During these months, Isabella was encouraged to change her underwear even more frequently, sometimes twice a day if she had been out riding or walking in the gardens. The smell of her clothes changed with the season. The harsh winter smoke was replaced by the sun-warmed smell of dry linen, sometimes with a faint scent of rosewater if supplies were plentiful that year. Sweat was not considered shameful. It was simply a sign of stress. But to remain sweet, as her ladies would say, Isabella lightly dusted her skin with fragrant powders, often made from crushed orris root, which left a pale mark on the skin and clung delicately to the folds of her dress. In summer, her hair was tied back more often to keep it from sticking to the back of her head, and combed in the shade of open windows, where a breeze would blow away the heavy air. Autumn, the smell of stored things. Autumn in the castle was perhaps the busiest season. Grain was brought in and stored in cool chambers. Apples and pears were laid out on wooden shelves in the cellar, their scent mingling with the faint tang of fermenting cider. Isabella's garments, too, were prepared for the colder months ahead. Heavier wool dresses brought out, lighter ones stored away in chests with lavender and wormwood to deter moths. With the arrival of cooler weather, the daily wiping with water became less frequent. Instead, cloths dampened with wine or vinegar were sometimes used for the face and hands, thought to be healthier as the air grew chill. Hair powders with warming spices, such as cinnamon or clove, made brief appearances, filling the combing chamber with a scent both sharp and sweet. The year as a circle. This slow turning of the seasons shaped Isabella's sense of what it meant to be clean, presentable, and cared for. There was no rigid schedule as we might imagine today, no wash every day commandment, but rather an unspoken understanding that one's grooming should be in harmony with the time of year, the weather, and the availability of warmth and water. To her, this was as natural as the turning of the sun. The changing smells of the rushes on the floor, the feel of a shift dried in summer air versus one dried in winter smoke, the way her hair felt after a long combing in the cool of spring. These were the markers of personal care. The girl becomes the young lady. By her mid-teens, Isabella had grown into the role expected of her. She no longer needed to be dressed entirely by her nurse, though Marina still attended to her hair and clothing each morning. She had her own small coffer of scented items, not the perfumed bottles of later centuries, but small cloth bags of dried flowers, carved wood combs, and little pots of salves made from beeswax and herbs. She was beginning to understand, too, that her body was part of the display of her family's wealth and refinement. The smoothness of her linen, the care with which her hair was arranged, the absence of visible dirt on her hands. These spoke as loudly in the court as jewels or fine fabrics. Cleanliness was less about health and more about the language of appearance, a language every noblewoman learned. Still, through all these years, she had not bathed in the way we now imagine. No immersion in a tub, no soaping from head to toe. That, in her mind, was something almost ceremonial, an act tied to important thresholds in life. And one such threshold was approaching. The year had turned, and the castle's courtyards, which only weeks ago had echoed with the sound of carts carrying autumn harvests, now lay under a thin, crystalline frost. The air was sharp in the mornings, though the midday sun still found ways to scatter warmth into the sheltered gardens. It was during this crisp, in-between season that the preparations for Isabella's wedding began in earnest. In a noble household, a wedding was never merely a private affair. It was a declaration of alliances made, of wealth displayed, of lineage secured. The Kostilska castle, which for so many years had existed in a quiet rhythm of daily life, began to stir with an unusual sort of energy. Servants moved with more purpose. New bolts of cloth arrived from distant towns. The kitchens tested sweetmeats and spiced wines in preparation for the feasts to come. And in the center of it all was Isabella, no longer the quiet girl of the castle corridors, but a bride-to-be, whose body would soon be presented to her husband, and whose appearance would be examined quietly but carefully by those who attended the wedding. This, in her world, was not a matter of romance, but of readiness. And part of that readiness was a ritual almost as rare as a coronation: the bath. The castle bathing chamber. Unlike modern castles reconstructed for display, the Kostilska keep did not have private bathing rooms attached to every chamber. Baths were events, not fixtures. The chamber where Isabella would bathe was used only on special occasions: births, important feasts, the arrival of high-ranking guests, and weddings. It was a small room compared to the great hall, but large enough to hold a wooden tub, a hearth for heating water, and space for servants to work. The walls were of stone, hung with thick cloth to soften the echo and keep in the heat. A single narrow window looked onto the inner courtyard, but for bathing, it would be shuttered and covered with wool to keep out drafts. The air in this room, when prepared for use, was unlike any other in the castle. It carried the smell of warm water, not the chlorinated scent we know today, but something faintly metallic, mingled with the woody aroma of the tub's staves and the faint sweetness of herbs steeped into the water. For days before Isabella's bath, bunches of dried rosemary and lavender had been hung in the room, so that when the steam rose, their scent would mingle with it. The wooden tub. The bath itself was not a pool, but a large, deep, barrel-shaped tub made of oak, bound with iron hoops. It had been polished on the inside until it was smooth. But even so, the grain of the wood was visible beneath the water when it was filled. To fill such a tub required patience. Buckets of water were heated over the great kitchen hearth in copper cauldrons, then carried up the stairs by servants, each bucket steaming in the cool air of the stairwell. The water was poured into the tub in slow, careful streams so as not to splash or lose heat. Some of the water was scented: rosemary for cleansing, chamomile for softness of skin, a little vinegar for what physicians believed was the strengthening of the body. The process could take hours, and all the while, the tub would be kept covered with a heavy wooden lid to hold in the heat until the moment came. Preparation of the bride. For Isabella, the bath was not the first step in her wedding preparations, but one of the last. In the days before, her hair had been carefully trimmed and examined, her nails cleaned and shaped with small knives, her hands softened with salves made of beeswax and almond oil. Her shifts and gowns for the wedding had been inspected for loose stitches, and her bedding for the wedding night aired and scented. The bath was both a practical cleansing and a symbolic one. To enter the water was to leave behind her unmarried life. To emerge from it was to step into her new role. For this reason, it was not a moment to be rushed. In the hours before, Isabella would be seated in a warm chamber, her outer gown removed so that she wore only a soft linen shift. Her hair would be brushed, not with the quick, functional strokes of an ordinary morning, but with slow, deliberate passes, each one smoothing strands until they shone in the firelight. Entering the bathing chamber. When the moment came, she would be led into the bathing chamber by her attendants. The air here was warmer than any other place in the castle, and heavy with steam. The wooden shutters were closed, the rushes on the floor freshly laid. In the corner, a smaller brazier burned, adding both heat and a faint scent of charcoal. Servants would help her remove the shift, leaving her bare in the flickering candlelight. This was not a moment of embarrassment. Modesty in such rituals was different than in modern times. But it was not public either. Only her closest ladies and the bath attendants were present, women who had known her since childhood. The bathing itself, she would step into the tub slowly, lowering herself into the warmth until the water reached her shoulders. The sensation, after years of only brief contact with water, must have been almost overwhelming. The heat would loosen the stiffness from her limbs, soften the skin, and bring a light flush to her cheeks. Her attendants would pour water gently over her hair, letting it run down her back in rivulets. There was no soap in the modern sense. Instead, cloth dipped in the herbal water would be used to wipe the skin. Special attention would be given to her arms, neck, and feet, areas thought to be important for both beauty and health. The hair, after being rinsed, might be treated with a final pour of rosewater, leaving it faintly scented. A fine-toothed comb would pass through it while still damp, the steam making each strand soft. After the bath. When the washing was done, Isabella would rise slowly from the tub, and her attendants would wrap her in large linen sheets, warmed before the fire. She would be seated again, her skin gently dried and her hair loosely braided to keep it from tangling before it was styled for the ceremony. The tub would be emptied bucket by bucket, the steaming water carried away to be poured onto the frosty ground outside, sending small clouds into the cold air. This bath, her second in a lifetime, was both an ending and a beginning. She would go to bed that night feeling a freshness unlike any she had known since the first hours of her life, the herbal scents lingering as she drifted into sleep. Tomorrow would be her wedding day, and this preparation, slow and careful, was as much a part of the event as the vows she would speak. The Queen's private chamber was not a place of indulgence in the way we might imagine a royal suite today. It was a room that felt as though it had been carved from silence itself. Thick walls, heavy curtains, and furniture that seemed to have stood still for centuries. The light in the morning was soft and slow, filtered through narrow, leaded windows, each pane slightly clouded with the imperfections of medieval glass. The bed was not the sprawling, feathery sort of modern comfort, but a sturdy wooden frame with ropes stretched to support a mattress stuffed with straw and wool. This mattress was often lumpy, and so it had to be beaten and turned regularly by her attendants. Layers of linen sheets, washed rarely, were placed upon it, and over those were heavy woolen blankets and fur coverings for the colder seasons. The linens held the faint scent of the chamber itself, a mix of beeswax polished from the furniture, the lingering perfume of herbs tucked into bedding, and the faint, unavoidable hint of human presence that came from fabrics seldom washed. At the head of the bed, there was often a small pillow, firmer than what most of us would find comfortable, stuffed with feathers that had long since flattened. The Queen's head would rest there at night, her hair covered with a linen coif to keep it tidy and to protect it from the dust of the room. This coif was also a practical measure. Hair was not washed frequently, and keeping it bound was a way to preserve its neatness for as long as possible. In the mornings, the chamber was never rushed into activity. First came the gentle creak of the door as the closest of her ladies entered. They would move slowly, their soft leather shoes making almost no sound on the rush-strewn floor. The rushes themselves were renewed only periodically, a mixture of dried grasses and herbs like lavender or rosemary, which were believed to freshen the air and discourage pests. The first task was to bring in a ewer of fresh water from the kitchen or well. This water was cold. There was no expectation that it should be warm for daily use. It would be poured carefully into a shallow brass or pewter basin, and the Queen would dip her fingers into it, touching her face lightly to refresh herself. This was, in essence, the extent of her morning washing, a symbolic cleansing rather than a thorough one. Her hands might be rubbed with a piece of cloth or a small sponge, but the rest of the body was left untouched. It was a rhythm the entire court accepted, a rhythm shaped by belief, by climate, and by habit. The Queen's garments for the day would be laid out with care. First, the linen undergarment, a chemise, was slipped over her head. It was simple, light, and usually the only part of her attire that touched the skin directly. Over this would come heavier layers, a kirtle, often of fine wool, and then the gown or surcoat that signified her station. These layers were not just for appearance, but for warmth, as the castle's walls held the chill of the stone even in warmer months. Before dressing fully, her ladies might bring a small cloth dipped in scented vinegar, which she would press lightly to her temples or the nape of her neck. This was thought to be both refreshing and protective against foul airs. the invisible mists people believed could carry illness. It was a small comfort in a world where bathing the whole body was not considered necessary or even entirely safe, outside rare occasions. There was a kind of dignity in the slowness of these routines. Nothing was hurried. Each step unfolded at its own pace, as though time itself moved more gently within these walls. The Queen, like many of her rank, did not question the rarity of baths. Her understanding of health, shaped by the learned physicians of her day, told her that too much immersion in water could weaken the body, open the pores, and invite sickness. Instead, cleansing was a matter of cloth and scented water, of changing linens and maintaining layers between skin and the outer garments. This careful, minimal routine was accompanied by soft conversation, never pressing, never urgent. Her ladies might speak of the weather as it filtered in through the windows, or of the quiet movements of the castle staff. Beyond the chamber door, life went on with its own subdued rhythm. The shuffle of servants in the corridors, the distant knock of a wooden spoon against a pot, the faint calling of pigeons from the courtyard. In such a world, where the idea of daily bathing was almost unimaginable, the Queen's private chamber was less a place of washing than a place of gentle preparation. It was here that she began her days with calm composure, wrapped in the slow customs of her time. And in the long decades of her life, the chamber would see her through both seasons of celebration and seasons of quiet seclusion, each day beginning not with the splash of a bath, but with the soft murmur of water poured into a basin, and the rustle of linen drawn close about her. The privy chamber, though a place of practical necessity, was also a small sanctuary of privacy in the otherwise communal rhythm of medieval life. In castles and grand houses, these spaces were sometimes tucked into the thickness of a wall, a narrow recess with a small stone or wooden seat, beneath which waste might fall into a cesspit or directly into the moat. The opening to the outside was discreet, often shielded by a wooden shutter to keep out the wind and prying eyes, though one imagines that the mingling of scents was not entirely avoidable. For Queen Isabella, whose life was marked by formality and ritual, even the simplest of acts could become ceremonial. Servants, trained in discretion, would prepare the chamber with folded cloths, clean rushes on the floor, and perhaps a small earthenware vessel of dried herbs or lavender to soften the air. There is no record of the Queen herself fussing over such details. Rather, they were seen to by women in her household, whose role was to preserve her comfort without intruding upon her dignity. In less fortunate households, the privy was far humbler. Perhaps nothing more than a bench above a pit in a small timber shed outside. Here, a pail might serve, emptied each morning into the midden heap along with vegetable scraps. Privacy was minimal, for walls were thin and locks rare. The idea of a separate solitary space for such needs was a luxury, not a standard. In towns, waste disposal was a matter of both necessity and community tolerance. The night soil collectors, working in darkness and with practiced efficiency, would remove the contents of cesspits and haul them away, often to be sold as fertilizer to farmers beyond the walls. Their work was both essential and uncelebrated, and the sound of their carts rumbling away in the early hours was part of the unspoken background of urban life. Water for washing after such visits was rarely flowing in the chamber itself. Instead, basins and ewers stood nearby, filled by servants or by the household's children from the kitchen well. In wealthier homes, These basins were of glazed pottery or pewter, the water sometimes scented with a few crushed leaves of rosemary or mint. For the poor, a simple wooden bowl sufficed, and the water was plain, drawn cold and often reused for multiple purposes before being thrown out into the yard. Seasonal changes affected even this aspect of daily life. In winter, the chamber could be a bitterly cold place, and in castles, the stone walls held the chill deep into spring. Servants might drape woolen cloth along the seat or hang a thick curtain to block drafts. In summer, the opposite problem arose. The chamber might be stifling, the air heavy with both heat and the smells that clung despite attempts at masking them. Herbs, flowers, and in some cases, burning incense were used to sweeten the space, though they did more to soften perception than to truly remove the cause. For Isabella, whose daily habits were noted less in personal journals than in the accounts of her household, the privy chamber was one of the few rooms where she might be briefly unobserved. Even here, the heavy layers of court dress would need careful handling. Silk and brocade lifted clear of the floor, pins and laces loosened by trusted hands before the queen could settle into her private routine. The idea of unassisted convenience was a rare one in such a life. Beyond the queen's world, in monasteries, the latrines were communal, built over flowing water when possible. Rows of stone or wooden seats stood side by side, with no partitions between them, the monks sitting in silence, eyes cast downward, as part of their daily order. The water below, often diverted from a nearby stream, carried the waste away, though in winter it also carried in the cold. For all their simplicity, these systems were often more effective than those in crowded towns, where stagnant cesspits could linger for decades without proper cleaning. The privy chamber, then, was not merely a utilitarian necessity, but a small window into the broader patterns of medieval comfort and discomfort. It reflected a world in which privacy was rare, in which the separation between the ceremonial and the bodily was maintained by layers of service and ritual. For the queen, it was a controlled space. For the commoner, it was an inevitable part of the day's rhythm. And for all, it was a reminder of the limits of medieval cleanliness, an era in which scents, sights, and textures were simply part of life. The queen's bedchamber in Kostilska's stone palace was a place where light itself seemed to enter cautiously, as though uncertain it was welcome. The tall, narrow windows were set deep into the wall, allowing only softened rays to filter through the small panes of greenish glass. By the time they reached the interior, the beams had lost their sharpness and became more like the diluted glow at the bottom of a river. Muted, unhurried, patient. In one corner stood a bed so wide it could easily fit 4 sleepers, though it was intended for only one queen. Heavy curtains of crimson velvet hung from a canopy, the folds thick with years of dust and the lingering perfume of the herbs once sewn into the lining. These curtains were drawn most of the time, not for secrecy but for warmth, and perhaps for the comfort of enclosure. Within, the bedding consisted of linen sheets, slightly rough to the touch, and several woolen blankets whose colors had faded to soft browns and muted reds. The mattress, stuffed with straw and dried lavender, released a faint, earthy scent when pressed. The chamber air was neither fresh nor unpleasant. It carried the layered fragrance of old wood, wool, and stone warmed by the occasional fire. There was also the almost imperceptible trace of rosewater, applied not recently, but in the way that perfume clings to fabric long after the bottle has been put away. That rosewater came from a small glass flask on the queen's table, its contents cloudy from age. Isabella was known to dab a drop behind her ears before public occasions. On ordinary days, however, the queen's natural scent was the product of her clothing, the air of the palace, and the dust of the years. Bathing was not a daily or even seasonal occurrence for Isabella. Her court, like much of Europe at the time, believed in the dangers of immersing the body in large quantities of water. They feared that water could open the pores to illness, that it could weaken the flesh or disturb the humors thought to govern health. Instead, care for the body meant the careful brushing of hair to remove dust, the shaking of garments to release crumbs and insects, and the occasional wiping of face and hands with a dampened cloth infused with herbs. In the mornings, a maid would bring a small copper basin filled with lukewarm water. The queen would dip a linen rag into it, wring it out with deliberate slowness, and press it against her cheeks, her forehead, and her neck. She did not scrub, only patted and pressed in a ritual that took no more than a few minutes. This was followed by a dusting of finely ground rice powder or crushed orris root, which would settle like a pale veil over her skin. The scent was subtle and short-lived, but in the queen's chamber, every gesture had the permanence of habit. Her hair was her crown in more than the symbolic sense. Long, heavy, and dark, it was brushed nightly for what could be nearly an hour. The maid assigned to this task sat slightly behind the queen, pulling the wooden comb slowly from scalp to tip, untangling with fingers first, then passing the comb through each loosened strand. The sound was gentle but steady, a faint rasp of wood against hair, a rhythm that seemed to slow the entire room. Often during this time, Isabella's eyes would half close, not in sleep, but in the kind of rest that comes from deep stillness. Her clothing added to the scents and textures of the space. Wool and linen absorbed everything from the smoke of the hearth to the faint must of the cedar chest. In winter, she wore long-sleeved gowns lined with fur, the edges softened by use. In summer, lighter fabrics allowed more air to pass over the skin, though even then the body was never truly bare to the breeze. Undergarments were changed when they could no longer be aired back to freshness, and outer garments lasted for many wearings before being washed. To protect these fabrics, servants beat the dust out with willow rods or brushed them with stiff horsehair brushes. At night, before she retired, Isabella would sip a cup of warm wine mixed with honey. This was said to settle the humors and calm the stomach. The chamber grew quiet except for the distant sounds from the guard's post and the occasional flutter of bats outside the windows. She would lie down upon the straw-filled mattress, pulling the blankets up to her chin, the faint scent of lavender in the bedding mixing with the rose water on her skin. In this way, the queen passed her evenings, surrounded by the accumulated fragrances and textures of a life lived almost entirely within these stone walls. The bedchamber, in its simplicity and slow rhythm, was a mirror of Isabella's own habits, unchanging, deliberate, untroubled by haste. Here, time moved like the slow drift of dust through a shaft of afternoon light. And the queen, for all her rank and authority, lived within its measured, unwashed grace. By the time Isabella was nearing her wedding, the world around her had shifted into a slower, more deliberate rhythm. The court at Kostelska was filled with the quiet bustle of attendants and servants, each moving with a sense of purpose that was nonetheless restrained, as though the palace itself demanded a certain calm. There were fabrics to be embroidered, letters to be sent, and arrangements to be made for the guests who would travel from afar. Yet, In the midst of these gentle preparations, one event stood apart: the ceremonial bath. It had been decided, perhaps years in advance, though no one could quite remember when the idea first took root, that the young queen-to-be would undergo a full washing before her marriage. Not simply a rinsing of hands or the face, not the perfuming of the hair or the rubbing of a cloth along the arms, but an immersion in water, as she had been immersed at her birth. This would be the second such moment in her life. It was to be not only a matter of cleanliness, but a symbol, a purifying before she entered her new role. The bath would take place in a chamber seldom used, a small stone room at the far end of the palace. Here, the walls were thick enough to hold warmth, and a narrow window allowed a softened light to spill in from the courtyard. Days before the event, attendants began preparing it. They scrubbed the stone basin that had sat dry for seasons, running cloths over its edges to remove any lingering dust. Copper vessels were brought in, their bellies round and burnished, ready to hold heated water drawn from the kitchen hearth. Water was not simply fetched and poured. It was treated almost as an honored guest. Buckets of spring water, brought from the well beyond the orchard, were carried in slowly, in steady procession. The water was clear and cold, and it would need to be warmed before it touched the queen's skin. In the great kitchen, fires were fed throughout the day, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint tang of iron kettles. When steam began to rise, the water was poured into the copper vessels, then mixed with cooler water until it reached the desired warmth, not scalding, not tepid, but somewhere in between. Before the bath itself, the attendants prepared oils and herbs. Small earthen bowls held rosemary, lavender, and a pinch of dried marjoram. The herbs were not for scrubbing. Such vigorous friction was considered unseemly for a royal bride, but for steeping in the bath water, lending it a fragrance that would cling lightly to her skin. Beside these bowls stood a small flask of oil, pressed from olives and infused with a trace of rose petals. It would be rubbed into the skin afterward to soften and scent it. When the appointed day arrived, the palace was hushed in a way that felt different from ordinary mornings. Footsteps were quieter. Even the voices of servants seemed to drop into a lower register, as if not to disturb the sanctity of what was to occur. Isabella, pale and calm, was led to the bathing chamber by her ladies. Her gown was removed slowly, layer by layer, each fold of fabric handled as though it might crumble if rushed. When at last she stood wrapped only in a linen sheet, she was seated upon a low stool beside the basin. Two attendants knelt to test the water's warmth with their wrists. Satisfied, they poured a final infusion of herbs into it, the small green leaves swirling lazily before settling at the surface. The queen stepped into the water, guided by hands at her elbows. The basin was not large. She could not float, nor even fully stretch her legs. But it was deep enough that the water rose to her waist as she sat. There was no scrubbing brush, no vigorous lathering. Instead, a soft cloth was dipped in the warm water, then gently pressed along her arms, her shoulders, and her neck. The motion was slow, more like an anointing than a wash. Her hair, unbound for the occasion, was lifted and let fall into the water, where the herbs caught for a moment before slipping free. Drops rolled down her temples and cheeks, glistening briefly before they were wiped away with another cloth. No words were spoken during this time. The attendants worked in silence, broken only by the faint sound of water lapping against stone and the muted call of a pigeon somewhere in the courtyard beyond. It might have been 5 minutes, or it might have been 30. The slow, unhurried movements made time difficult to measure. When the cloth had passed over every part of her, and her hair had been rinsed one final time, the queen was helped to her feet. A thick linen towel, warmed by the fire in the kitchen, was draped over her shoulders. She was patted dry rather than rubbed, to avoid reddening the skin. The rose-infused oil was then poured, drop by drop, into the attendant's palm and smoothed over her arms, her back, and her hair. The scent was faint but distinct, a whisper of gardens in bloom. When she was dressed again, first in fresh linen, then in a simple robe, Isabella was led back to her chambers. The bath water remained in the basin for some time after, cooling slowly as though reluctant to surrender the memory of its rare use. Later, it would be poured out into the palace gardens, where the herbs might return to the soil from which they had grown. For the rest of that day, the queen was to remain indoors, shielded from the dust of the courtyard and the smoke of the kitchens. She sat near a high window, sewing with her ladies, her skin still carrying the subtle scent of the bath. The moment had passed, but its effect lingered, not as an act of mere cleanliness, but as a gentle reminder of the life she was about to enter, and the deliberate pace at which the old world moved when it wished to mark an occasion. The late afternoon in the castle would often bring a stillness that felt like a gentle sigh after a long day. Outside the high stone walls, the autumn light would begin to soften, sliding slowly across the courtyard, making the moss on the stones glow faintly green. Within Queen Isabella's private chambers, the air carried the faintest scent of lavender. Dried flowers tucked into linen pouches and placed discreetly among her garments. It was not a common indulgence. Lavender was costly, often reserved for those of high standing, yet even this small touch was less about cleanliness in the modern sense, and more about surrounding oneself with a pleasant air. The queen's attendants, quiet and deliberate in their movements, would sometimes prepare what could loosely be called a bath. Not a daily or even weekly occurrence, but a rare act of preparation, almost ceremonial. In this age, water was a strange companion, both necessary and suspect. Physicians and scholars of the court often spoke in measured tones about the dangers of bathing too often, believing that warm water might open the pores and invite illness. Thus, the idea of immersing oneself was approached with caution, more a ritual of occasion than a matter of habit. When such a bath was deemed necessary, it was not the rushing convenience of a modern tap and tub, but a slow, collective effort. Servants would fetch water in wooden buckets from the well in the outer yard, their steps steady as they carried the weight through the cool corridors. The sound of water sloshing against the bucket's sides would echo faintly off the stone walls, mingling with the muted rhythm of their footsteps. Each bucket lifted and poured into a large wooden tub would release a dull splash, the surface rippling and catching the candlelight. The water itself was rarely clear in the way we think of it today. Even the cleanest well water would carry the faint tint of earth and sometimes a trace of leaf or straw. To soften it, herbs might be added, sage, rosemary, or marjoram, bundled tightly in cloth and steeped in the water until the warmth coaxed out their fragrance. This was not only for scent, but for what was thought to be medicinal benefit. The steam would rise gently from the surface, carrying with it the suggestion of gardens in summer. Though beyond the castle walls, the season might be cold and barren. The queen would approach such a moment with the same calm she brought to many of her daily routines. Servants would help her loosen the layers of her gown, the fine fabrics folding softly into the hands that gathered them. The sound of cloth sliding against cloth was faint, almost like a whisper. Beneath, a chemise of light linen, worn close to the skin, would be removed in turn. The air on her skin would feel different then, cool in the room, yet tinged with the warmth of the rising steam from the tub. Stepping into the water was a slow act. The wood beneath her feet would be smooth from years of use, the surface sometimes faintly scented with the ghost of past herbal baths. The warmth of the water would travel upward, first meeting the skin with a mild surprise, then settling into a comfortable embrace. There would be no rush to submerge. She might sit quietly at the edge for a time, letting her feet rest in the heat before easing herself down until the water reached her waist, her shoulders. The attendants would work without hurry, using cloths to gently pour water over her hair, which was not often washed, but instead combed and oiled to maintain its smoothness. The sound of the cloth dipping into the tub, then squeezing, would be a slow rhythm, drip, 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 as the excess fell back into the bath. The queen's hair, heavy when wet, would fall forward like a curtain, catching the candlelight in glistening strands. Any oils or scented waters used would be modest in quantity. Such things were expensive and precious, often brought from distant lands. Conversation in these moments, if it happened at all, was quiet. Words, when spoken, would be soft and unhurried, perhaps an observation about the weather, or a comment on the last letter received from a neighboring court. Sometimes there would be silence, broken only by the sound of water shifting as a cloth passed gently over her shoulders, her arms. When the bathing was done, the process of leaving the tub was just as deliberate as entering. The attendants would lift large linen cloths, warmed by the fire, and wrap them around her. The fabric would drink the water from her skin, leaving behind a faint herbal scent. Her hair would be gently blotted, never rubbed too briskly so as not to encourage tangles. The tub, once emptied, would reveal the fine traces of herbs left behind, like the last memory of the bath fading into the evening air. Afterward, she would dress in fresh garments, a chemise that felt crisp against the skin, followed by the carefully layered gowns suited to her station. The chamber would grow dimmer as the sun slipped away, the last light of day touching the stone walls with gold before disappearing entirely. The small fire in the hearth would offer a low, steady crackle, and outside, the faint sound of wind through the courtyard arches might be the only reminder of the world beyond the room. In the stillness that followed, the queen would sit by the window, her hair drying in the quiet warmth of the fire, while the night slowly gathered itself around the castle. The act of bathing, so rare in her life, was not an interruption of routine, but a gentle, almost timeless interlude. A slow dance between water, steam, and stillness, lingering in memory long after the herb's fragrance had faded. In the quiet world of Queen Isabella's court, where life moved at a slow and measured pace, the question of cleanliness was often solved not with water, but with layers. Layers of cloth, layers of fragrance, and layers of etiquette. By the middle of the 14th century, the art of masking bodily odors had become a refined practice, equal parts necessity and fashion. A lady of noble standing, such as Isabella, would rise in the morning to a careful selection of garments. These were not chosen hastily. Each piece was layered according to the temperature, the occasion, and her station. First came the linen chemise, its soft fibers sitting directly against the skin, meant to absorb the oils and perspiration of the body. Over this came the gown, often made of wool or silk, and sometimes another gown over that, especially if visitors were expected. It was not uncommon for these layers to be heavy and warm, even in milder weather, for modesty demanded that very little of the body be suggested, much less revealed. Between these layers, small pockets or pouches of herbs might be sewn. Little satchels filled with lavender, rosemary, or even dried rose petals. The herbs released a faint fragrance with each movement, creating the illusion of freshness without the need for bathing. For the queen, these pouches were often prepared by her ladies-in-waiting, who took pride in selecting the most fragrant blends from the gardens and storerooms. Perfume in Isabella's time was not the light, airy mist we know today, but a heavier, oil-based substance, often thick with musk or ambergris. Applied sparingly to the wrists, behind the ears, or even dabbed onto the edges of a veil, it clung to the fabric and released its scent over the course of the day. There was an understanding that one did not mask odors completely. Rather, one transformed them, allowing the mingling of natural and added scents to create what was considered a pleasing personal aroma. The very air of the queen's private chambers reflected this approach. Bowls of dried flowers sat on shelves, sprigs of mint and thyme hung from beams to discourage pests while lending a faint, herbal freshness to the room. The floor might be strewn with rushes mixed with chamomile or marjoram, so that each step released another layer of scent. Cleaning, in this sense, was less about removing dirt and more about replacing the air with something more agreeable. Clothing maintenance was equally important. Without regular washing of the body, the garments themselves needed attention to prevent odors from becoming too strong. Linen undergarments might be laundered once every few weeks, boiled in water and lye, and laid out in the sun to dry and bleach. Outer garments, which were far more expensive and delicate, were rarely washed at all. Instead, they were brushed, beaten, and aired out by hanging them in the breeze. Occasionally, they might be lightly steamed with fragrant herbs in boiling water, the vapors helping to freshen the fabric. The queen's laundresses, often working in pairs, developed their own quiet rhythm for this work. They knew that the garments of the court could not be handled roughly, yet they also knew that they carried the sense of daily life, of meals, of smoke from the hearth, of the faint but persistent trace of human presence. In tending to these garments, they tended to the very image of the court itself, ensuring that Queen Isabella and her household would always appear and smell appropriately refined. Even the choice of materials was shaped by these habits. Linen was favored for its absorbent quality and its ability to be laundered without too much damage. Wool, especially fine wool, resisted dirt and odors better than other fabrics, while silk, though delicate, was prized for the way it seemed to hold perfume, releasing it gradually as the wearer moved. Over time, these customs formed a kind of quiet language. To those who moved in noble circles, the scent of certain herbs or oils could signal one's station, wealth, or even regional origin. A faint trace of violet might hint at French influences, while rosemary and sage suggested English or Northern European tastes. For Isabella, who ruled in a court where multiple cultures met, her scent might carry hints of imported spices from the East, mingled with the familiar herbs of her homeland. And so, in the absence of daily bathing, Queen Isabella's world relied on layers of cloth, of fragrance, and of careful ritual. To live in such a time was to accept that water was not the only path to cleanliness. It was instead a matter of creating an atmosphere, both around the body and within the home that suggested freshness, dignity, and refinement. Even if the skin beneath had not felt the touch of warm water for many months. Imagine, if you will, a quiet corner of the old Kostilska Palace, a space that might have been, in another age or in another land, a bathhouse. But here in the 14th century, the room is not quite that. Its walls are bare stone, pale from years of candle smoke and the slow accumulation of dust. There is no steam curling in the air, no sound of water trickling into a basin. Instead, it holds chests of linen, folded and stacked with care, as though cloth might stand in for cleanliness. The Middle Ages in Isabella's part of the world did not always favor the warm immersion of the body in scented water. Public bathhouses did exist in certain towns, some left over from Roman times, others built later in imitation. But they had already begun to fall out of favor among the nobility. There was suspicion, both practical and moral, about the act of bathing. Physicians sometimes claimed that water could seep through the pores and weaken a person, that warm baths might soften the flesh and invite illness. Moralists spoke in hushed voices of bathhouses being places of temptation, not virtue. In the palace, bathing was a smaller, drier affair. The word might mean little more than a thorough rubbing with cloth soaked in wine, or the careful dusting of the skin with fine powders to mask or absorb oils. Queen Isabella, as records suggest, had such baths only rarely. Once, as an infant, she had been washed in warm water, her mother and the midwives deeming it necessary after birth. The second time, years later, was before her wedding, when her ladies prepared her to meet her husband in a manner befitting ceremony. The rest of her life passed without immersion in water as we think of it. There were reasons for this, of course, beyond custom. Water was not always clean, and in cities it was often drawn from sources shared with animals. In rural estates, wells could be deep, and the lifting of water a labor in itself. To heat enough for bathing meant a fire, time, and the carrying of heavy buckets. Such effort, when weighed against the prevailing ideas about health, often seemed unnecessary. So Isabella's bathroom remained a linen room, a place for storing shifts, towels, and perfume sachets. From a small window, one could see the palace orchard, its trees standing in ordered rows. On winter days, frost would gather along the sill, and the air in the room would smell faintly of dried lavender, tucked into the folds of the cloth. Here, attendants might bring a basin for washing the face and hands. Here, a lady might sit while her hair was combed and dusted with scented powder, the motions slow and careful, the rhythm of them more ritual than necessity. One wonders whether Isabella ever thought about water, the feel of it on the skin, the way it might have offered a moment of release on a hot day. Perhaps she saw the river that wound past Kostilska's walls, watched the fish flicker in its shallows, and felt no longing for it. Or perhaps, in some unspoken way, she knew what she was missing. We cannot be certain. The records are silent, and her own voice, if ever recorded, is lost. Outside the palace, in the market town, things were different. Common folk might bathe in streams during summer, or visit what bathhouses remained in colder months. They did so not from luxury, but from a mix of necessity and tradition. Their water was shared with laundry, with the rinsing of vegetables, with the washing of tools. The queen, meanwhile, lived in her measured, scented world, a place where the notion of cleanliness came from the careful changing of linen, the brushing away of dust, and the avoidance of what was considered the risk of water. It is a strange thing, perhaps, for us to imagine, a bathhouse that was never used for bathing. But in Isabella's time, it was entirely ordinary. And so the room stayed as it was, year after year, a quiet space of cloth and air, where sunlight fell in thin rectangles across the floor, and no steam ever rose. If you have been with me since the first gentle words of this story, you may now feel as though you have walked, or perhaps drifted, through a slow gallery of images, one where the frames are filled with stone walls, soft candlelight, faint scents of herbs, and the hush of centuries past. And here we are, at the final frame. The room is warm, the night is deep, and the journey of Queen Isabella's world, with its rare baths and quiet customs, is almost complete. It is perhaps fitting to end not with a grand event, but with a still moment, as the Middle Ages themselves often ended a day, with the quiet closing of shutters, the drawing of a blanket, and the slow fading of a candle. The Queen, in the later years of her life, sat more often in the oriel window of her chamber. The cushions there were faded but comfortable. From this place she could look out over the gardens, not the manicured ones of modern palaces, but the medieval sort, uneven, practical, half for beauty and half for usefulness. Beds of herbs grew alongside flowers, small fruit trees dotted the edges. In summer, the hum of bees was constant. In winter, frost drew delicate white webs along the edges of the stone. Her habits by then had changed little from her youth. Washing the face each morning, a bowl of warm water for the hands, fresh linen against the skin. These were the small comforts that repeated like the tolling of a familiar bell. The great bath, with its steam and wooden tubs, had been many years past. She would sometimes speak of it to her ladies, almost wistfully, but without any sense of loss. To her, it had been a ceremonial moment, not a regular practice. And so she kept to the rhythm she knew, which, to her mind, had served her well. Beyond Isabella's window, life in the town continued in ways she might have recognized from her girlhood. People still fetched water from wells. Soap, when made, was still boiled in great kettles with ash and animal fat. In the evenings, smoke curled up from hearths, carrying with it the mingled smells of wood, food, and damp air. We often think of history as a series of dates and great changes. But here, in these small, unremarkable repetitions, lay the true texture of the Middle Ages. The sound of cloth being wrung out, the creak of a bucket being lifted, the faint scent of rosemary in a wash basin. These things did not make it into chronicles. Yet they were the notes of the everyday music that people lived by. And perhaps that is why the thought of Queen Isabella's rare baths still lingers. Not because she was unusual in it, she was, in truth, much like her contemporaries, but because it opens a small doorway into a world where comfort was measured differently, where a bath was an event, not a convenience, where scents and oils were not so much about removing all traces of the body, but about overlaying it with the season's chosen fragrance. As the candle burns low, it is tempting to imagine that the Queen, and those like her, would be surprised at us now, at our daily showers, our endless varieties of soap, our insistence on freshness that must be renewed each morning. She might find it wasteful, or perhaps she would find it a kind of luxury beyond the reach of her time. Or maybe, like so many of her century, she would simply nod and accept it as the way of the world, as she had accepted hers. In the great sweep of history, from the warm bathhouses of ancient Rome to the perfumed salons of later centuries, hygiene has been not just a matter of cleanliness, but of culture, of belief, and of what was thought fitting for one's place in society. Queen Isabella's story sits quietly within that long arc, a small candle flame in a room filled with the layered air of the past. And so, as we close this long, slow walk through the Middle Ages, it is not the dates or the edicts that remain most clearly in the mind, but the stillness of that window seat, the low light, and the sense of life lived in gentle repetition. In that sense, perhaps, the Middle Ages never quite end. They remain with us, in the quiet corners of our own routines. The night is deep now. The streets are silent. And this, perhaps, is a good time to rest. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your thoughts are still wandering the narrow corridors of Isabella's castle, let them drift into sleep. The candle can burn on without you. The story is complete, but the world it described will wait for you, should you wish to visit it again. Good night.